I let my unemployed brother, Jake, stay in my house, rent-free, while I worked a 2-year contract in Dubai, only asking him to cover utilities and keep the place clean until he got back on his feet. 8 months later, my mom called to say the power was cut off at my house. My cousin's FaceTime walkthrough showed beer bottles everywhere, burn marks on the counter, a random dog, and Jake had been telling people the house was his. Then a realtor called to say Jake was trying to list my house for rent online, using forged ownership documents with my signature he'd cut out from old birthday cards. I work in the medical field and recently got a lucrative 2-year contract in Dubai. Since I wouldn't be living in my house during that time, I offered to let my younger brother Jake stay in it. Notice I said stay, not take over. Jake was going through a rough patch, just lost his job, his girlfriend kicked him out, and he was crashing at our mom's place. Our mom lives in a small condo and honestly doesn't need the stress. I felt bad for him and said he could stay at my house temporarily until he got back on his feet. We agreed that he would cover utilities and basic maintenance, keep the place clean and in good condition, start looking for a job again, ASAP. I explicitly said, "You're not staying here for free, just rent-free. Pay the bills and take care of the house." He said, of course, and thanked me like I was a saint. Fast forward 8 months. I was sending money home to help our mom with her meds and groceries. During a video call with her, she mentioned the power got cut at my house. I was confused. Jake was supposed to be handling utilities. I messaged him and asked what happened. He replied with, "Oh yeah, it's been off for like a week. I've just been staying at my friend's place." What? So you're not even living in my house? And you're not paying the bills? I started asking more questions, and it all went downhill from there. The yard looked like a jungle. My neighbors said they hadn't seen him around in weeks. There was a notice from the city about the garbage pileup and rats. I was livid. I called Jake again and told him I wanted to do a virtual walkthrough of the house. He kept stalling. "The Wi-Fi's down. I'm busy. Let's talk next week." So I did what any responsible homeowner would do. I asked my cousin, who lives nearby, to stop by and check the house. She FaceTimed me from the porch. I nearly cried. Trash bags were piled up by the front door. The mailbox was bursting. The windows were grimy. When she got in, using the spare key I gave her, I saw beer bottles everywhere, a burn mark on the kitchen counter, my sofa was ripped, and my spare room, my home office, had been turned into what looked like a gaming cave, complete with LED lights, a recliner, and ashtrays. The worst part? A random dog was there. I don't even own pets. I called Jake immediately and absolutely lost it. He said, "Chill out. It's just a house. I've been meaning to clean up. I'm just going through stuff." I told him he needed to get out. Immediately. He acted all confused. "Why are you kicking me out? I thought this was my place while you were gone." "Excuse me?" He then says, "I figured since you weren't here, it didn't matter. You have a good job now, you don't need the house. I've kind of been telling people it's mine." I was speechless. Telling people it's his? I asked him if he ever paid for utilities. He admitted my mom paid some of the bills because he was tight on cash. I was beyond furious. He was freeloading off both me and our mother. I gave him 2 weeks to move out. I even offered to help pay for a storage unit for his stuff and gave him leads on job openings my friend had sent me. He started playing the victim. "You're abandoning me. You're rich now and don't care about family. You're kicking me out during a hard time." I reminded him that he'd been getting back on his feet for 8 months and managed to trash my house in the process. He guilt-tripped our mom, who called me crying, saying Jake told her I was making him homeless. I had to show her videos of the damage just to make her understand I wasn't being petty. I was protecting my property. Eventually, he left, but not quietly. He trashed me on social media, calling me selfish and saying, "Some people forget who was there for them once they get a little money." What? He was never there for me. I gave him a free place to live, and he repaid me by turning my home into a dump. I got a cleaner to deep clean the house, replace the sofa, fix the burn marks, and sent Jake the bill. He blocked me. Now our family is split. Some say I was too harsh and that family helps each other no matter what. Others agree he took advantage, and I did the right thing. I just feel used. I tried to help him, and he walked all over me. But just when I thought it was finally over, I got a call from a realtor. Jake's been trying to list my house for rent online, and my phone started buzzing before I could even process what Tom Harrison was saying. I was sitting in my office at the hospital in Dubai, patient charts spread across my desk, when Tom explained that Jake had shown up at his real estate office with paperwork claiming he owned my house. My hands started shaking as Tom forwarded me the listing while we were still on the phone. There it was on 3 different rental sites. My trashed house advertised as newly renovated 3-bedroom home, with a monthly rent of $2,500. The photos showed my damaged property from angles that hid the worst parts, and the listing had Jake's phone number as the contact. Tom said Jake had forged ownership documents using what looked like my signature, probably copied from old birthday cards or something. I immediately called my bank and told them to freeze any accounts connected to my property address, then started taking screenshots of everything. My next call was to Marcus Smith, a property lawyer my hospital's legal department recommended when I explained the situation during our morning staff meeting. I shared my screen with Marcus during our video call from my Dubai office, showing him the fraudulent listings and forged documents. Marcus stayed calm while I was practically hyperventilating, telling me we needed to file police reports for fraud and identity theft right away, plus send cease and desist letters to every rental platform Jake had used. He walked me through the steps while I typed everything up, his professional tone helping me focus instead of just screaming into the void. That's when my phone lit up with a text from Jake, just a link to the rental listing followed by a laughing emoji. Another text popped up saying, "You said I could stay there, never said I couldn't make money off it." I wanted to throw my phone across the room but forced myself to screenshot everything instead, because this wasn't just him being desperate for money anymore. This was him deliberately trying to destroy me. My phone rang at 3 a.m. Dubai time with Mom sobbing on the other end, saying Jake had shown up at her condo demanding money for a lawyer because someone reported his rental business. She kept asking why he needed a lawyer for renting a house, completely unaware that he was committing fraud using my property. I spent the next hour explaining everything while she went back and forth between not believing Jake could do this and making excuses about how stressed he must be. The next day, I couldn't focus on anything at work, lying in bed that night adding up all the damage in my head. 8 months of unpaid utilities came to around $2,400. The property damage was at least $5,000. Legal fees were already starting at $3,000. And now identity theft charges on top of everything. My supposedly amazing Dubai contract felt like a prison, keeping me 8,000 miles away while Jake destroyed everything I'd worked for. The worst part was realizing I was sending Mom money for her medications every month while Jake was bleeding her retirement savings dry. Rachel started sending me videos the next morning, showing 3 different families walking through my house with some guy who definitely wasn't Jake. She confronted the showing agent who said Jake hired him through Craigslist for $100 per showing plus commission if anyone signed a lease. One family had already submitted an application with a $3,000 deposit that went straight into an account Jake had set up using my address. Rachel got the agent's contact info and recorded him admitting Jake promised him 5% commission on a year's lease. Marcus filed an emergency injunction that afternoon to stop any rental agreements from going through while I sat at my computer filing online police reports for fraud and identity theft. The Phoenix PD assigned Officer Patricia Reeves to my case, and she seemed genuinely shocked when I emailed her the forged ownership documents. Jake had apparently cut out my signature from old birthday cards and thank you notes, then scanned them onto fake property transfer papers. Officer Reeves said she'd seen a lot of family fraud, but this level of planning was unusual. Mom called me again during another video chat, this time from her condo, where she finally admitted she'd been giving Jake money. She showed me her bank statements on camera, and I saw withdrawal after withdrawal labeled helping Jake totaling $4,000 over 6 months. She thought she was helping maintain my house, paying for repairs and utilities like a good mother helping both her kids. Instead, Jake was using her retirement money for who knows what while my house fell apart. 3 days after everything started, Tom called again with more information, saying he'd kept all the emails where Jake tried to list the property with multiple agencies. Most agencies rejected him immediately when he couldn't provide proper documentation, but Jake got more aggressive with each rejection. Tom had saved screenshots of Jake threatening to leave bad reviews and report agencies to the state board if they didn't list his property. He offered to provide sworn testimony about Jake's attempts to commit fraud through his agency. Then Derek called me directly, which was weird because Derek had been Jake's friend since high school and was letting him crash at his place. Derek said Jake owed him $2,000 and had tried to pay with a check from the rental deposit account he'd set up. Derek was done with Jake's lies and wanted to know if I'd cover the debt in exchange for information about Jake's other schemes. I told him I wasn't paying Jake's debts, but suggested he should probably talk to Officer Reeves about what he knew. That same night, my phone started buzzing nonstop with texts from Jake. The messages kept coming one after another, first trying to guilt me with stuff like how could I do this to my own brother, then switching to straight-up threats about how I'd regret this when I got back from Dubai. I was sitting in my apartment scrolling through them when one made my blood run cold. He wrote that Mom's health couldn't handle all this stress, and whatever happened to her would be on me. I screenshot everything and sent it straight to Patricia, who said she'd add it to the file. The next morning, Marcus called with good news. He'd gotten an emergency injunction to stop any rental activity at my house, and the court had notified those 3 families who'd paid deposits about the fraud. 2 of them went straight to the police station to file their own reports against Jake. The showing agent even gave Marcus a recording from his phone where Jake was clearly saying he owned the property and was just waiting for some paperwork to clear. Marcus said this was exactly the evidence we needed. 3 days later, Rachel called me panicking. She'd gone to check my mail and found a stack of past due notices for credit cards I never opened. Jake had been using my house address to apply for cards and loans in my name. She counted up the notices, and the total was over $15,000. When she checked with one of the credit card companies, they told her my credit score had dropped 200 points in just 3 months. I felt sick to my stomach as she read off the account numbers and amounts owed. Patricia called me that afternoon with even worse news. She'd been digging into Jake's background and found out this wasn't his first time pulling this kind of thing. He had a sealed juvenile record, but she'd gotten access to it and saw he'd been expelled from community college for selling fake parking permits to other students. She said with all the evidence piling up, she could build a case for serial fraud and identity theft, which meant serious prison time, not just a slap on the wrist. That evening, I sat in my Dubai apartment watching the sunset over the city, feeling completely alone. Every time my phone buzzed, I felt my stomach drop, wondering if it was more damage Jake had done, or Mom calling to defend him again, or another threat from him. I'd started recording every phone call and taking screenshots of everything like I was some kind of detective investigating my own life. The isolation was getting to me, being so far from home while all this was happening. My neighbors, the Johnsons, emailed me the next day, absolutely furious. Jake had been parking in their driveway, claiming I'd given him permission to use their space too. When Mr. Johnson confronted him about it, Jake threatened to call Adult Protective Services on them for harassment. They'd installed security cameras after that and caught Jake trying to steal packages from their porch. They sent me the video files and I forwarded everything to Patricia. A week after I'd first found out about the rental scam, Mom's doctor called me directly. She'd been brought to the emergency room with chest pains related to stress. When I got her on video call, she was crying in her hospital bed, saying Jake had told her I was trying to destroy the family. He'd convinced her that if he went to jail, it would be her fault for raising us wrong. The manipulation was literally making her sick, and I could see how pale and weak she looked lying there with monitors beeping around her. Derek must have gotten scared because he reached out to Patricia with text messages showing Jake bragging about his rental empire. The texts had Jake talking about using the money to start a marijuana grow operation in my garage. There were even photos of Jake wearing designer clothes and holding expensive electronics, all while he'd been telling everyone he was broke and needed help. Patricia said this was exactly what she needed to show intent and planning. Marcus called the next morning with the biggest bombshell yet. He'd been going through insurance records and discovered Jake had filed a claim for water damage at my house 6 months ago. Jake had collected $8,000 from my insurance company but never did any repairs. The insurance fraud meant this was now federal territory, and Marcus said the FBI's white-collar crime division was getting involved. I couldn't believe how deep this went and how many different ways Jake had been scamming not just me, but everyone around him. That night, I had another video call with Mom in her hospital room. She looked so small and fragile in that bed and finally admitted something that broke my heart. Jake had been threatening to never let her see him again if she took my side in any of this. She'd been enabling him not because she believed his lies, but because she was terrified of losing her son. She said he'd been manipulating her for years, using her love for him as a weapon to get what he wanted. Rachel flew out the next morning to Phoenix and went straight to my house with her camera and notebook, texting me that she'd document everything for the insurance claim and police report. She started in the living room where the torn sofa had stuffing spilling out like guts, and beer stains had turned the carpet into a Jackson Pollock painting of neglect. Moving through each room took her 6 hours total, and with every photo she sent my phone, I felt my chest getting tighter. The kitchen counter had multiple burn marks from what looked like hot pans or maybe cigarettes, and the garbage disposal was completely broken with food rotting inside it. She found drug stuff in my bedroom dresser drawer, including pipes and little plastic bags with residue that made her put on gloves before touching anything else. The garage was the worst part because Jake had turned it into some kind of illegal poker room with a professional table, casino chips, and even a cash counting machine plugged into the wall. Rachel counted 17 folding chairs stacked against the wall and found a ledger with names and dollar amounts that went back months, showing he'd been running games every weekend. She photographed every page of that ledger and found flyers he'd printed advertising high-stakes Phoenix home games, with my address listed right there for anyone to see. While she was still documenting everything, her phone started blowing up with messages from our aunts and uncles asking about some GoFundMe page Jake had created that morning. He'd posted it from wherever he was hiding and titled it, "Help Me Fight Medical Industry Greed," with a long sob story about how his rich doctor sister was making him homeless. The worst part was he'd used a photo of Mom in her hospital bed hooked up to oxygen, claiming I'd caused her heart problems by stressing her out with my greed. 3 of our cousins had already donated $50 each before Rachel could message them the truth about what was really happening. She screenshot everything, including the part where Jake claimed he'd been maintaining my house for free as a favor while I lived it up in Dubai making tax-free money. The fundraiser got flagged for fraud within 2 hours after Rachel reported it and sent them photos of the actual damage Jake had done to the property. Marcus called me on day 10 with news that made everything even worse because the property management company Jake had tried to use had been recording everything from the start. They'd been suspicious when Jake showed up with documents that didn't look quite right. and decided to record their whole meeting, including the part where he was on speakerphone coaching someone on what to say as a reference. Their security cameras had caught him in their lobby for 20 minutes practicing my signature over and over on blank papers before coming up to their office. The company's owner was so concerned about potential fraud that they'd saved everything and contacted Marcus directly, offering to testify if needed. Patricia called me at 3 a.m. Dubai time to tell me they were executing a search warrant on Derek's apartment, where Jake had been crashing since I kicked him out. They found my old passport that I'd reported stolen 2 years ago, sitting right there in a desk drawer, along with blank lease agreements that already had my forged signature at the bottom. Derek's laptop had dozens of documents Jake had been creating, including fake pay stubs from my hospital showing income I never earned, and tax returns with numbers that didn't match anything real. Jake was there when they showed up and tried to run out the back door, but Phoenix PD had officers waiting in the alley knowing he might bolt. They arrested him right there for identity theft, fraud, and possession of stolen property, while Derek just stood there crying and saying he didn't know anything about any of this. During the booking process at the jail, Patricia discovered something that made my whole world tilt, because Jake had been collecting disability payments for the last 6 months using my social security number. He'd filed a claim saying he'd injured his back at my hospital during a work accident and had been getting checks sent to a P.O. box he'd opened in my name. The federal investigators got involved immediately, and Patricia warned me this could affect my medical license, since the claim was filed as if I was the one who got injured and was committing fraud. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the phone when she explained that the Dubai work visa might get revoked if the federal charges stuck to my social security number. 2 days later, Jake called from jail and left a voicemail that started with him crying and begging for help. But halfway through, his voice changed to something cold and mean. He said he knew about Tampa and what happened during my residency, and asked how my career would look when everyone found out about the kid who died on my watch. My blood went ice cold because that case still haunts me, even though the parents thanked me for doing everything possible to save their daughter who came in too late with meningitis. Jake knew exactly where to stick the knife because I'd told him about it years ago, when I was dealing with the trauma, and he was pretending to be supportive. Mom got a letter from him the next day filled with old photos from when we were kids, and 3 pages of manipulation about how I was always the favorite and got everything while he got nothing. She called me sobbing so hard she could barely breathe, saying maybe if she'd been a better mother or loved him more, this wouldn't have happened. But I knew this was just Jake's way of hurting everyone. The letter had lines like, "Remember when she got the new bike and I got the used one?" And, "You always went to her recitals but missed my games," which were complete lies since Mom never missed anything he did. I started checking the medical board website every hour, waiting for Jake's threatened complaint to appear, and jumping every time my phone buzzed thinking it was HR calling about an investigation. The kid who died in Tampa was only 4 years old, and even though 3 other doctors agreed we did everything right, I still wake up sometimes thinking about her parents' faces when I had to tell them. Jake knew I'd testified in the morbidity and mortality conference about that case, and that every detail was documented, but he also knew how to twist facts to make them look sinister. My Dubai hospital's legal department scheduled an emergency video meeting after someone sent them screenshots of Jake's GoFundMe, along with an anonymous email claiming I was involved in family fraud schemes. They believed me when I explained everything and showed them the police reports, but they still had to put me on administrative review pending the resolution of the criminal case, which meant no surgeries and reduced pay. The anonymous email had been sent from a library computer in Phoenix, and included parts of Jake's story that only he would know, which told me he had friends on the outside helping him attack my reputation. Rachel discovered 2 weeks after his arrest that Jake had given an interview to some Phoenix blogger who ran a site called Desert Justice Warriors that usually covered local government corruption. Jake had painted himself as a victim of medical establishment greed and claimed I'd abandoned our sick mother to chase money in Dubai while he stayed behind to care for her. The blog post went viral in local Facebook groups with hundreds of comments from people who didn't know us but had opinions about rich doctors and family values. My high school friends started texting, asking if the story was true, and I had to explain over and over that Jake was lying while watching my reputation get destroyed in real time. The blogger had used a photo of my house looking perfect from 2 years ago, next to recent photos, making it look like Jake had improved the property instead of destroying it. 2 days later, Patricia called while I was reviewing patient charts in the break room and told me Jake's public defender was building their whole defense around something called implied permission. They were claiming I knew Jake was renting out rooms and that I'd given him verbal approval during one of our phone calls. The lawyer wanted every single text message, email, and voicemail between us going back 5 years. Patricia said the discovery process was normal, but it felt like Jake was digging through my whole life looking for anything he could twist. I had to send Marcus screenshots of thousands of messages, most of them just me checking if Jake was okay, or reminding him about basic stuff like paying the water bill. That night, I couldn't sleep and kept checking my phone every few minutes, thinking another disaster was about to hit. My hands were shaking during a routine procedure the next morning, and Dr. Hassan pulled me aside asking if everything was okay. I started triple-checking every medication dose and every chart entry because I kept thinking any tiny mistake would somehow end up in court. My coworkers started covering for me when they noticed I was taking 20 minutes to do 5-minute tasks. Patricia called again 3 days later with worse news. Derek had flipped completely and was telling the police everything to save himself from charges. He said Jake had been talking to other guys in jail about paying someone to break into my house and destroy any paperwork or computer files that could be used as evidence. Patricia took it seriously enough that she had patrol cars driving by my house every few hours. I called Rachel right away and told her to get a security company out there immediately. I didn't care what it cost. She had cameras, motion sensors, and new locks installed within 48 hours. The forensic accountant Marcus hired started sending me reports that made my stomach drop. Jake hadn't just tried to rent my house. He'd opened 12 credit cards in my name using documents he'd stolen from my filing cabinet, 3 personal loans totaling $80,000. He'd even tried to refinance my house by forging my signature on the paperwork. The total fraud attempt came to $273,000. Marcus said this pushed everything into major federal crime territory with potential 20-year sentences. I threw up in the hospital bathroom after reading that email. Mom called crying again, but this time it was different. Her sister Catherine had flown in from Seattle without telling anyone and showed up at Mom's condo ready for war. I could hear Catherine yelling in the background about how Mom had enabled Jake for years. Catherine told Mom that Jake had stolen $8,000 from her back in 2018, but Mom had refused to believe it and called Catherine a liar. Now the whole family was taking sides with some relatives saying we should support Jake no matter what, and others saying he'd finally gone too far. Then Jake's ex-girlfriend Melissa messaged me on Facebook out of nowhere. She had voice recordings from when they were dating of Jake talking about his plans for my house. In one recording from 3 months before I even left for Dubai, Jake was drunk and saying he'd finally get what he deserved from the family favorite. He'd been planning this before I even offered to help him. Melissa said she'd testify if needed because Jake had stolen from her too, and she wanted him to face consequences. 3 weeks after Jake's arrest, I had to use my vacation days to fly back to Phoenix for depositions. The 16-hour flight felt endless knowing I was going back to deal with a destroyed house and broken family. I'd hired a property management company to handle repairs, but they kept sending me photos of damage they said might be permanent, like the burn marks that had gone through the kitchen counter into the wood underneath. Walking into the courthouse for the deposition made my chest tight. Jake was already there in an orange jumpsuit looking thinner and pale, but when our eyes met, his face twisted with rage. While his lawyer was looking at papers, Jake mouthed the words, "You'll regret this," at me. The court reporter saw it, and so did the security guard who stepped closer to Jake's chair. His lawyer grabbed his arm and whispered something harsh, but the damage was done. Marcus used that threat in our filing the next day. The prosecutor laid out all our evidence in a meeting with Jake's public defender: bank records, forged documents, Derek's testimony, Melissa's recordings, the forensic accounting report showing the full scope of the fraud. The evidence was overwhelming, and Jake's lawyer knew it. They asked for a plea deal, but the federal charges made the prosecutor less willing to negotiate. She offered 8 to 12 years if Jake pleaded guilty to all charges, including identity theft, fraud, and attempted grand larceny. Jake turned it down flat and told his lawyer he wanted a jury trial because he could convince them I was the bad guy. 2 days later, we were having a family meeting at Mom's condo about the trial when Mom grabbed her chest and collapsed. The paramedics said it was a stress-induced heart attack and rushed her to the ICU. I sat in the waiting room still in shock when a process server walked up and handed me papers. Jake's lawyer was suing me for unlawful eviction and emotional distress, seeking $500,000 in damages. Jake was suing me while Mom was fighting for her life because of what he'd done to our family. The waiting room filled up with people I hadn't seen in months as word spread through the hospital about what was happening. Dr. Sarah Kim from psychiatry sat down next to me and handed me a coffee, while other doctors from my old department kept coming by to check on me. Sarah started explaining how Jake showed all the classic signs of narcissistic personality disorder, with the manipulation and the victim playing, and the complete lack of empathy for anyone else. 3 other doctors shared their own stories about family members who'd stolen from them or destroyed their property, and it helped knowing I wasn't alone in this mess. Marcus showed up with paperwork for a restraining order and said Jake's lawsuit was garbage that any judge would throw out immediately. The next morning, I finally got to sit beside Mom's bed in the ICU, and watching her hooked up to all those machines made everything clear. I could trace Jake's pattern all the way back to when we were kids, and Dad left, and Mom felt so guilty, she gave Jake whatever he wanted. Every job he lost was never his fault, and every girlfriend who dumped him was crazy, and every landlord who kicked him out was unreasonable according to him. Mom always believed his stories and sent him money and made excuses for him, and now she was paying the price with her health. A month later, we were in court for Jake's pre-trial hearing, and Tom the realtor showed up with printed emails where Jake had threatened to hurt him if he didn't list my house. The prosecutor read the threats out loud, and Jake started yelling that I'd paid Tom to lie, but the judge wasn't having any of it. The judge called Jake a clear danger to me and to witnesses, and denied his request to get out on lower bail, which made Jake completely lose it. He screamed that I'd bought off the whole system and had to be dragged out by 3 bailiffs while his lawyer just shook his head. Patricia called me that afternoon with more bad news about Jake's past that we never knew about. She'd found 3 landlords who'd filed police reports against him for property damage and unpaid rent going back 10 years. 2 of his ex-girlfriends had restraining orders against him for stalking and harassment that he'd never mentioned to the family. He'd been fired from 4 different jobs for stealing money or equipment, and each time he'd told us a different story about budget cuts or personality conflicts. The FBI got involved when they discovered Jake had been using my medical license number to create fake charity websites. He'd set up 3 different organizations claiming to provide medical care to refugees and collected $45,000 from people who thought they were helping. The forensic accountant showed me the bank records where Jake moved the money through multiple accounts before spending it on gaming equipment and partying. Derek finally cracked under pressure and gave police a recording from 3 months ago where Jake talked about burning down my house. The recording had Jake researching different accelerants on his computer and discussing how to make it look like an electrical fire for the insurance money. The detective said this moved the charges into attempted murder territory, since Jake knew I'd be coming back from Dubai eventually. Mom woke up on the 3rd day, and the first thing she asked about was Jake, which broke my heart. When I told her about the arson plans, her whole face changed and she whispered something I'll never forget. She said she always knew deep down that Jake was dangerous, but she thought if she just loved him enough, she could fix him. We went back to court the next week for Jake's countersuit, and the judge dismissed it in less than 10 minutes. Jake started threatening the judge right there in the courtroom, which got him contempt charges on top of everything else. His own lawyer asked to withdraw from the case because Jake had been sending him threatening messages too. My hospital in Dubai cleared me completely after their investigation and actually praised how I'd handled everything. Dr. Ahmed, my supervisor, told me about his own brother who'd stolen his identity and racked up huge debts in his name. Patricia kept digging and found the worst part of all when she discovered Jake had been stealing identities from our whole family. He'd been using our dead grandmother's social security number to file fake tax returns for 3 years. He'd opened credit cards in our cousin's kids' names and maxed them out buying electronics that he sold online. The investigation showed 23 different victims, including family members and people who'd tried to help him over the years. 6 weeks after Jake's arrest, Mom called a family meeting at her condo without telling Jake about it. 23 relatives showed up, more than I'd seen together since Grandpa's funeral 5 years ago. Everyone sat in Mom's living room passing around coffee and cookies while Uncle Robert stood up first. He pulled out his phone and showed us bank statements from 2019 when he'd loaned Jake $8,000 for a supposed business opportunity that never existed. Aunt Marie went next, explaining how Jake had stolen her credit card and charged $1,500 at Best Buy before she noticed. Cousin Brian revealed Jake had taken his Xbox and PlayStation while house-sitting and sold them on Facebook Marketplace. The stories kept coming for 2 hours, each one worse than the last. Uncle Robert saved the worst for last when he told us Jake had broken into Grandpa's storage unit 3 months before he died and stolen his World War II medals. Jake pawned them for $300 at a shop downtown, and when Grandpa found out, he spent his last weeks trying to track them down. The pawn shop had already sold them to a collector in Japan, and Grandpa died knowing his most prized possessions were gone forever. Mom sat there crying as she heard story after story about her son's lies and theft going back 15 years. The next morning, I flew back to Phoenix and met Rachel at my house with a contractor named Bill, who specialized in crime scene cleanup and restoration. Walking through the house felt like entering a violation museum, where every room held new damage I hadn't noticed before. Bill pointed out holes Jake had punched in the drywall behind furniture, looking for what he called hidden safes rich people always have. The master bedroom closet had been torn apart with the drywall ripped open and insulation pulled out everywhere. Jake had even pried up floorboards in the guest room searching for cash he was convinced I'd hidden. Bill measured everything and took photos while calculating the repair costs, which came to $32,000. He suggested doing a complete renovation to reclaim the space and remove all traces of what Jake had done. 3 days later, I met with federal prosecutor Amanda Johnson at her office downtown, where she laid out 847 pages of evidence across her conference table. She played recordings of Jake's jail calls where he tried to get Derek to threaten witnesses and destroy evidence at Derek's apartment. Jake didn't know all jail calls are recorded, and he'd given them hours of him planning witness intimidation and evidence destruction. Amanda showed me transcripts where Jake told another inmate he'd make sure nobody testifies, and that he had ways to handle snitches. She warned me Jake would try to play victim in court and claim I'd abandoned him, but she felt confident the evidence would speak for itself. The next week, Jake fired his third public defender and filed paperwork to represent himself in court. The judge spent 40 minutes trying to talk him out of it, explaining how complex federal fraud cases were and how he'd be facing experienced prosecutors. Jake insisted he knew the law better than any lawyer and immediately filed 47 different motions, including one demanding I be arrested for stealing his house. He subpoenaed my high school math teacher, my first boss from McDonald's, 3 ex-girlfriends, and 28 people from my Dubai office. The judge threw out all the subpoenas as irrelevant, but Jake kept filing more every day from his jail cell. Mom's health got worse from the stress, but she agreed to do a video deposition from her doctor's office where she could take breaks for her medication. She sat in front of the camera for 3 hours describing how Jake would call her crying and threatening to kill himself if she didn't send money. She showed bank records of $43,000 she'd sent him over 2 years, money she'd taken from her retirement savings. She broke down sobbing when she described Jake screaming at her that she was a terrible mother who wanted him dead when she said she couldn't send more. The prosecutor used her testimony to reclassify Jake from defendant to victimizer in the case narrative. 2 weeks later at the federal courthouse, Jake showed up for pretrial motions wearing a wrinkled suit and carrying a cardboard box full of papers. When prosecutor Amanda mentioned the charity fraud involving cancer patients, Jake jumped up and tried to lunge at her across the courtroom. 3 bailiffs grabbed him and pinned him to the ground while he screamed about conspiracies and persecution. The judge ordered him removed and scheduled a psychiatric evaluation to determine if he was competent to stand trial. The court-appointed psychologist spent 8 hours with Jake over 3 days and submitted a 20-page report. Jake had antisocial personality disorder with narcissistic features, showing no ability to feel remorse or empathy for his victims. The psychologist noted Jake genuinely believed he deserved everything he'd taken and felt rage at being caught, not guilt for his crimes. The evaluation deemed him competent, but noted he posed a danger to others and should remain in custody. 2 months after his arrest, I had to fly back to Dubai to keep my work visa active and fulfill my contract obligations. The 14-hour flight felt like traveling between 2 different lives, neither of which felt like home anymore. I worked night shifts at the hospital to stay awake for Phoenix time zone calls with lawyers and investigators. My Dubai apartment became a makeshift legal office with boxes of documents and evidence folders covering every surface. Meanwhile, back in Phoenix, the Johnsons, who lived 3 houses down, filed a civil suit against Jake for harassment and property damage. They had security camera footage of Jake keying their Mercedes and pouring herbicide on their prize-winning rose garden after they'd complained about his loud parties. 4 more neighbors came forward with similar stories of vandalism and threats when they'd complained about noise or trash. The HOA sent me a letter threatening to sue me for $15,000 in fines Jake had racked up, though Marcus was fighting it by arguing I wasn't responsible for criminal acts by a tenant. During a recorded jail call to Derek, Jake tried to recruit another inmate's cousin to visit witnesses and convince them to forget what they saw. The FBI intercepted the call and added witness tampering and conspiracy charges to Jake's case. With the new federal charges, Jake's potential sentence jumped from 15 years to over 40 years in prison. They moved him to federal isolation after discovering he'd been trying to coordinate attacks on witnesses from inside the county jail. 3 weeks later, Mom called me crying about starting therapy with someone who specialized in family manipulation and codependency issues. The therapist had her bring old home videos and recordings, and Mom sat there watching 8-year-old Jake screaming threats at her when she wouldn't buy him a toy. The pattern stretched back decades, tantrums that turned into threats, threats that turned into manipulation, and Mom just kept giving in every single time. She sent me audio files from when Jake was 12, threatening to hurt himself if she didn't let him skip school for a month. The therapist explained trauma bonding, how Jake had trained her since childhood to fear his reactions more than anything else. Mom kept apologizing to me through tears, saying she should have gotten him help instead of always caving to his demands. Patricia called the next morning with news that made my skin crawl. Jake had been recording our family for years, storing hundreds of hours of private conversations on encrypted drives they found in Derek's apartment. He had Mom on tape admitting she helped him lie on rental applications by pretending to be his employer reference. He had me venting about difficult patients after rough shifts, complaining about hospital politics in ways that could damage my career if taken out of context. He had Rachel talking about her husband's drinking problem and their marriage counseling sessions. The detective said Jake labeled each file with dates and potential uses, like he was building a blackmail library for future leverage. My hands shook as I listened to Patricia describe folder after folder of our most private moments turned into weapons. Back in my Dubai apartment, I was making coffee when Marcus called with the first good news in weeks. The insurance company reviewed all the evidence of Jake's intentional damage and approved covering 90% of the repairs. They were also filing a civil suit against Jake to recover the $20,000 fraudulent claim he submitted saying the house was burglarized. Marcus said every bank, credit card company, and government agency Jake had defrauded was lining up to press charges or file civil suits. The federal prosecutor estimated Jake now faced over $2 million in restitution orders on top of his criminal sentences. That night, I couldn't sleep. Just kept having the same nightmare where Jake stood in front of a jury painting me as the rich sister who abandoned family for money. In the dream, he showed them photos of our childhood, talked about how I left him homeless while living in luxury, and the jury nodded along sympathetically. I'd wake up drenched in sweat and immediately check Phoenix News websites, terrified he'd somehow made bail or escaped. My doctor here prescribed anxiety medication, but I couldn't bring myself to take it, because what if something happened and I wasn't alert enough to respond? 10 weeks after his arrest, the hospital administrator asked me to join a video call about my contract. The board was concerned about potential negative publicity when Jake's trial started, worried that having an employee connected to such a high-profile federal case might damage the hospital's reputation. They offered me a buyout to leave quietly, 3 months' salary if I resigned within 72 hours. The professional consequences Jake had threatened were actually happening even though I was the victim in all this. I stared at the resignation papers for hours, knowing Jake would see this as a victory even from his cell. Then Melissa, Jake's ex-girlfriend, contacted Patricia with recordings she'd kept from their relationship. Jake had researched specific psychiatrists known for giving questionable diagnoses for the right price, planning to have me declared mentally incompetent so he could take power of attorney. He'd actually drafted commitment papers with a doctor who later lost his license for fraud. The recording had Jake explaining how once I was declared unfit, he'd control my finances and could also take guardianship of Mom since she was on medication for her health issues. Melissa said she kept the recordings because Jake scared her with how calculated everything was, like our whole family existed just to serve his needs. The prosecutor called me at 3 a.m. Dubai time with news that made my blood freeze. Jake had been writing to a Mexican prison gang from his cell, offering my Dubai address and work schedule in exchange for protection inside. The gang had contacts in the UAE, and the State Department was taking the threat seriously enough to get involved. Within hours, 2 security officers showed up at my apartment saying I needed to relocate immediately for my safety. They helped me pack essentials while explaining that Jake's correspondence showed he'd researched my exact route to the hospital, what time I usually left for work, even which coffee shop I stopped at most mornings. Mom video called me the next day, holding a letter she'd written to Jake with shaking hands. She read it out loud, her voice getting stronger with each word about how she loved the little boy he used to be, but couldn't enable the man he'd become. She told him this was goodbye, not forever maybe, but for now and for as long as it took him to get real help. She said she'd been in therapy 3 times a week, learning how her enabling had hurt both her sons, and she was choosing to protect herself and support me instead. It was the first time I'd ever heard her stand up to Jake without immediately backing down or apologizing. Rachel organized a family support video call that night with cousins, aunts, and uncles I hadn't talked to in years. Everyone had a Jake story: money he'd borrowed and never returned, lies he'd told to turn family members against each other, items that went missing when he visited. Our uncle broke down crying when he admitted Jake had convinced him I thought he was trash, which was why our uncle had been cold to me at family gatherings for years. Jake had told each of us lies about the others, keeping everyone isolated so no one would compare notes and figure out his games. The call went on for 3 hours as people finally shared what Jake had done to them, and for the first time we all felt less alone in this nightmare. 2 days later, the news broke that Jake had tried to escape during transport to federal court for a hearing. He'd somehow gotten partially out of his restraints and attacked 2 federal marshals when they opened the van door, breaking one marshal's nose and giving the other a concussion. He made it 3 blocks before a police officer tackled him in front of a McDonald's, adding assault on federal officers and attempted escape to his charges. The prosecutor said this added at least 15 more years to his potential sentence and destroyed any chance of him claiming to be a model prisoner who deserved leniency. 3 months after his arrest, the FBI agent called me at 2 a.m. Dubai time with news that made me drop my phone. They'd found evidence of Jake running the exact same scam in California, Nevada, and Texas. He'd been using our dead grandparents' names, our cousins' social security numbers, and even created fake accounts under Mom's maiden name. The agent said they had 17 victims across 4 states, making this interstate fraud that fell under RICO laws. Jake was looking at life in prison now, not just 15 years. Derek had flipped completely for an immunity deal and handed over everything. He showed them Jake's journals from his apartment, 5 years worth of detailed plans and fantasies. The pages were filled with drawings of my medical degrees with his name on them, lists of ways to take over my identity, and notes about how he deserved my life more than me. One entry from 3 years ago said he wanted to become me completely and make everyone forget I existed. The FBI's digital forensics team recovered Jake's deleted hard drives and found something that made me throw up. He'd created an entire fake identity as a doctor using my credentials and had actually been treating people at underground clinics in Phoenix. 3 people had gotten infections from his fake treatments, and one elderly man almost died from wrong medication Jake prescribed. The FBI brought in victims from the other states to testify over video calls. An elderly couple from Nevada lost their entire retirement savings of $340,000 to Jake's investment scam. A single mother in Texas had her identity stolen so badly she couldn't get a job for 2 years. A small business owner in California went bankrupt after Jake used their company credit to buy luxury cars he then sold for cash. During the depositions, Jake sat there stone-faced until they mentioned the money amounts. Then he'd smirk like he was proud of it. The prison situation got worse when the gang members Jake had been hanging with found out he'd lied to them too. He'd promised them $500,000 from my supposed inheritance that didn't exist. They cornered him in the shower block before guards intervened, and now Jake had to be moved to protective custody for his own safety. He spent 23 hours a day alone in a cell, which the guards said was making him more unstable. I sat in my new Dubai apartment, the one I'd moved to after Jake's people found my first address, and realized I couldn't relax anymore. Every knock at the door made my heart race. Every unknown phone number could be another threat. Every stranger on the street might be watching me. Jake hadn't just stolen money and property, he'd stolen my ability to feel safe anywhere. Mom got released from cardiac rehab after her heart attack, but needed round-the-clock care now. The stress had aged her so much that people thought she was 15 years older than her actual age. She couldn't go back to her condo because Jake knew where it was and had sent people there before, so she moved in with my aunt in Seattle. Our whole family was basically living like we were in witness protection without the actual program. The prosecutor asked me to give a victim impact statement for the trial, and I had to do it over a secured video link because of safety concerns. I spent 3 hours detailing everything Jake had done, not just the financial losses, but how he'd destroyed our family. When I got to the part about finding drug needles and pipes in my bedroom, knowing he'd violated that private space just to hurt me, I broke down crying. The prosecutor told me afterward it was the most powerful victim statement she'd handled in 20 years. Jake's new lawyer, his 4th one, filed motion after motion trying to delay the trial. He claimed his previous lawyers were incompetent, that the prosecutor was biased, that the judge had it out for him, that his civil rights were being violated. The judge denied everything in one hearing, calling Jake's tactics bad faith obstruction of justice, and warning him that further delays would result in additional charges. 4 months after his arrest, they finally set the trial date for next month. Jake decided he wanted to testify on his own behalf, against every lawyer's advice. The guards told me he'd been practicing speeches in his cell, recorded on the security cameras. He was rehearsing how to cry on command, practicing sob stories about being abandoned by family, and making up symptoms of mental illnesses he didn't have. He'd written out a whole script about how I'd always been the favorite child, and how our parents neglected him, which was complete fiction since he'd been spoiled his whole life. 3 days before the trial was supposed to start, I got a call from the prosecutor at 6 in the morning telling me Jake had tried to hurt himself in his cell. My first thought was that he'd actually done it, but then she explained the guards found him with some shallow cuts on his arms that looked more like scratches than anything serious. They rushed him to the hospital anyway and put him under guard, while his lawyer immediately asked for the trial to be postponed. The prosecutor wasn't buying it and told the judge this was just another manipulation tactic. The judge ordered an independent doctor to check Jake out, and sure enough, the doctor confirmed the wounds were superficial and positioned where Jake could easily reach them himself without doing real damage. The night before trial, our whole family met at Mom's condo. Everyone who was going to testify or just be there for support. We couldn't talk about our testimony, but we could share strength. Mom looked so small and tired, but there was something different in her eyes, like steel underneath the exhaustion. Rachel had been amazing through all this, coordinating everything, making sure everyone knew when to be at court, keeping us all together. Even the cousins who defended Jake at first were there, saying they couldn't believe how wrong they'd been about him. That night after everyone left, I sat on my hotel balcony and wrote Jake a long letter, pouring out everything I'd never said, how I'd always made excuses for him to our friends, covered for his mistakes, genuinely wanted him to succeed. I wrote about all the times I'd defended him when people called him a loser, all the money I'd given him over the years that he never paid back, all the chances he'd thrown away. I folded it up, lit it with a hotel match, and watched it burn in the metal trash can, the ashes floating away on the Phoenix night breeze. The next morning, the prosecutor called with a warning that Jake had been calling reporters from jail, trying to sell his story as some kind of riches-to-rags family betrayal tale. One tabloid was actually interested until Marcus filed emergency injunctions to stop Jake from making any money off his crimes. The thought of him profiting from destroying our family made me want to throw up. On the first day of trial, I sat in the federal courthouse watching Jake shuffle in wearing a cheap suit his public defender got him. He tried to make eye contact with Mom and mouthed something that looked like, "I love you," but she just stared straight ahead. The prosecutor's opening statement was brutal, laying out 47 separate criminal charges with mountains of evidence for each one. Jake's lawyer gave his opening statement since the judge wouldn't let Jake represent himself during arguments, claiming I'd abandoned my poor brother to poverty while living it up in Dubai, that he was just trying to survive. Several family members actually got up and walked out when they heard that twisted version of reality, but Mom stayed put, gripping her sister's hand so tight her knuckles went white. The second day of trial, the prosecutor put up huge displays showing my real signature next to Jake's forgeries, and even I could see how bad his attempts were. Jake kept shaking his head and making faces for the jury, but they weren't even looking at him anymore. One juror actually looked disgusted when they showed the evidence of Jake stealing from the children's charity. Patricia took the stand next, going through every piece of evidence like she was teaching a class, calm and methodical. Jake kept trying to object even though he wasn't allowed to, and the judge had to tell him to be quiet 3 times. When Patricia played the recording of Jake threatening to burn down my house with me in it, Jake jumped up and yelled that it was taken out of context. The judge warned him one more time about outbursts, or he'd be removed from the courtroom. Then came the moment that changed everything. Derek took the stand, and I could see Jake's face go white. Derek looked terrible, shaking and sweating, but he told the truth about everything. He pulled out a bag and showed the jury the actual lighter fluid and rags Jake had hidden in his garage for the arson plan. Jake completely lost it, screaming that Derek was a lying junkie, lunging toward the witness stand before the bailiffs grabbed him. The jury saw exactly who Jake really was in that moment, violent and dangerous and completely out of control. The judge ordered him removed and said he'd watch the rest of the trial on a video link from a holding room. The courtroom was dead silent when Mom took the stand, looking so fragile but sitting up straight. She spoke quietly but clearly, telling the jury about every chance she'd given Jake, every lie she'd caught him in, every time she'd bailed him out, hoping this would be the time he'd change. When the prosecutor asked why she'd enabled him for so long, she looked right at the camera where Jake was watching and said she'd confused love with enablement, but she could see clearly now. Jake's face on the monitor went from shock to rage to something like panic, as he realized even Mom had turned against him. The next day, Jake's defense team took their turn, and it was almost sad to watch. They brought up 2 guys who said they knew Jake from some bar and tried to tell the jury he was just going through a tough time. The prosecutor asked them basic questions about Jake, and they couldn't even say what his job used to be or where he went to school. Then it came out that Jake had given them each $500 to show up. The defense also brought in some therapist who claimed Jake had temporary stress problems, but when the prosecutor checked his license, it turned out he wasn't even allowed to practice in Arizona anymore. The whole defense fell apart in less than 3 hours. The prosecutor gave her closing statement the next morning and went through everything piece by piece. She showed the jury photos of all 23 people Jake had scammed and listed out exactly how much money he took from each one. She talked about the 3 states where he'd pulled these cons and showed the video of him trying to burn down my house. She told them about how he threatened witnesses and tried to fake documents. Her last words hit hard when she looked right at the jury and said Jake wasn't some victim who needed help, but someone who hurt his own family on purpose. Jake's lawyer barely spoke for 10 minutes and just asked for mercy, without even trying to say Jake didn't do it. The jury left to decide, and we all waited in the hallway, eating vending machine snacks and checking our phones. 3 hours later, the bailiff called us back in. The jury foreman stood up and read guilty on every single count, all 47 of them. Jake started screaming on the video screen about how this was all rigged and he'd get revenge, but they cut his feed after about 30 seconds. Mom just collapsed into my arms, not crying or happy, just completely exhausted, like she'd been holding her breath for months. We sat in that courthouse hallway for an hour just holding each other. 3 weeks later, we came back for sentencing, and the judge didn't hold back. Jake tried to give some speech blaming everyone else for his problems, and even said he'd come after us when he got out, which probably wasn't the smartest thing to tell a judge. The judge gave him 37 years with no chance of getting out early for at least 25 years, and said his complete lack of taking responsibility made the sentence longer. After everything was done, I flew back to Dubai and told my boss I needed to resign, not because of any scandal, but because I needed to be home to help my family heal. My coworkers threw me a going-away party, and Dr. Ahmed wrote me this amazing letter saying I was one of the strongest people he'd ever worked with, which made me cry right there in his office. 2 months after the trial, Mom finally moved out of that awful apartment and got a smaller place near Rachel in Phoenix. She started going to therapy twice a week to deal with all the guilt she felt about enabling Jake for so long. Her health got so much better without all that stress, and she even started volunteering at this place that helps parents whose adult kids are in trouble. I decided to completely redo my Phoenix house and get rid of every trace of what Jake had done to it. The contractor suggested maybe keeping one little burn mark on the counter as a reminder that I survived all this, but I wanted everything gone and made new. I picked out new furniture and painted every room, and by the time it was done, the house felt like mine again with no bad memories left. Our family had our first holiday dinner without Jake, and nobody talked about him, even though there was an empty chair at the table. My uncle brought out these military medals that belonged to my grandfather, and admitted he'd bought them back from a pawn shop years ago after Jake stole them, but was too ashamed to tell anyone. We put them up on the wall where they belonged. I got a job at Phoenix Children's Hospital, which is where I'd always wanted to work anyway. My first day, I treated this little girl whose dad was in prison, and I could see in her mom's eyes the same pain my mom had been carrying. I gave her information about counseling services and support groups, and realized my whole experience with Jake could actually help other families going through similar stuff. 6 months after the trial, I had a barbecue in my backyard with all the neighbors who'd supported me through everything. The couple next door brought their famous potato salad, and Mom actually laughed for real for the first time in over a year. Rachel's kids were playing in the exact spot where Jake had tried to burn everything down, but now it was just a normal yard again. We grilled burgers and told funny stories, and nobody mentioned Jake at all. The house was full of people and laughter and good food, and it felt like a real home again, not the crime scene it had been. Jake took a lot from us, but he couldn't take away our ability to move forward and trust people again, and choose to be happy despite everything that happened. My house is mine again, and my family is healing, and we're all learning how to have a life that doesn't revolve around Jake's chaos anymore.